From the top rope and the Great American Bash, I bid you all good evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you may be in this great land of ours or around the world. Welcome to the $55 million studio on the Pro Wrestle Machine. In the world of professional wrestling, few figures command respect and intrigue in equal measure as does the Iron Sheik. Born as Hossein Khosrow Ali Vaziri in Tehran, Iran, in 1942, his life is a unique tapestry woven with strands of adversity, fame, controversy, and redemption. From his early days as an athlete in Iran to his rise as one of the most iconic villains in the history of World Wrestling Entertainment (WWE), his story is as dramatic and intense as the wrestling bouts he fought. Vaziri's story is not simply a tale of a wrestling superstar. It's the narrative of a man who transformed from a humble Iranian youth into the Iron Sheik, a character loved and reviled in equal measure by millions of wrestling fans worldwide. It's a tale of a man who grappled with personal and professional hardships, and who used his in-ring persona to navigate the challenges of his offering life. June 12, 2023 Observer Newsletter. The Iron Sheik passes away. Roman Reigns passes 1,000 days as WWE Universal Champion. By Observer Staff. The Iron Sheik, the Iranian heel who was part of pop culture at two different points in his life and was best known for feuds with Hulk Hogan and Sergeant Slaughter, passed away on June 7 at his home in Fayetteville, Georgia. He was listed as being 81 years old, but given he didn't know his own birthday and there are different years listed in different places at different times for his birth, it's more safe to say he was probably 80, and may have been as old as 84. He was listed as being born on March 15, 1942. In 1983, when I saw the Texas database with listed birthdays for pro wrestlers who were licensed in the state, his birthday at the time was listed in their records as March 15, 1939. His biographer, Keith Elliott Greenberg, who wrote what he once said was the best wrestling biography never published, said he was actually born September 9, 1942, which would have made him 80. The March birthday that's on his passport is incorrect, said Greenberg. He celebrated the September date in coordination with the Persian calendar. He told me he was born in 1942. Greenberg did admit in an article on Sheik that Sheik was not exactly sure when he was born. In many ways, the Iron Sheik was two completely different men. There was Khosrow Vaziri, a great amateur wrestler who lived a Spartan existence. He was known for his natural ripped physique from ridiculously hard training and a careful diet. He claimed he never had sex until he was 28 years old. He claimed he never touched a drug until he was 35. When Jimmy Snuka talked him into smoking marijuana, the straight-laced wrestler billed as an Olympic medalist from Iran was an undercard technical wrestling babyface, who also never made any money in pro wrestling. The Iron Sheik was the opposite, a man synonymous with excesses in all facets of life, most notably drugs, but with the gimmick, partially taken from the biggest drawing heel of previous decade, at the Sheik Farhat, and with the luck of the Iranian hostage crisis taking place, he became the perfect heel to face every babyface that was being marketed as an American patriotic hero. The irony is that only a few years earlier, the man who embodied the anti-American heel, playing on xenophobia, was actually the assistant wrestling coach of the U.S. Olympic Greco-Roman team. Hossein Khosrow Ali Vaziri was legitimately Iranian and a top amateur wrestler before being trained by Vern Gagne in his fabled 1972 camp, was known in pop culture first in the 80s for waving the Iranian flag to loud boos and also saluting while tag team partner Nikolai Volkov would sing the Russian national anthem before matches against the top babyfaces in the WWF. He was the transition WWF champion between Bob Backlund and Hulk Hogan for a month in late 1983 and early 1984, and his match with Hogan on January 23, 1984, in Madison Square Garden was the kickoff of the Hogan title run and WWF's national and later international expansions. He was the catalyst for Slaughter's babyface turn, and as Colonel Mustafa of Iraq, while people all knew it was the Iron Sheik, it was very much played down. In 1991, was Slaughter's tag team partner and eventual opponent again in a heel and subsequent face turn by Slaughter. The Sheik over the past 15 years had a second pop culture run, created by managers and twin brothers Paige and Jen Megan, who at times called themselves his nephews. They ran his social media account and would create a social media persona who would say all kinds of wacky things under his name. But it made his name bigger and it would get him bookings in places like the Howard Stern show where he say all kinds of all-the-wall things about jabronis, Kramer on Seinfeld, making Hulk Hogan and his favorite whipping boy, Brian Blair, humble and ripping on numerous other stars from that era. Blair noted that there was a wrestling skirmish when both were in WWF, and while Sheik was a high-class amateur, he was no longer in shape and past his prime when he started something with Blair. Blair said Sheik gassed out quickly, and he got the better of it, and Blair believed that was the catalyst in him becoming Sheik's constant victim of off-the-wall statements. They had Sheik do YouTube videos, filled with anti-Semitic, anti-gay obscenity-laced diatribes. Howard Stern heard about it and started playing them on the air, and would bring in Sheik as a regular guest. He called Randy Savage a cheap Jew and did all kinds of homophobic slurs on Ultimate Warrior, and talked about bending over and basically sodomizing his biggest targets, Blair and Hogan. Sheik was a great athlete, who started out as a clean-cut muscular babyface former amateur wrestling star. He made no money in that role, and in September 1976, babyface Khosrow Vaziri, while working in the AWA, changed his name to heel Iron Sheik, from an idea Mary Gagne, Vern's wife, had, because Vern thought the guy was such a great wrestler but he wasn't getting over as Ali Vaziri. He adopted a new look, with the shaved head and unique mustache that he became famous for. He wore trunks with a camel on them, which was a direct copy of the Sheik. He won his first championship as a pro wrestler in 1977 as Ali Vaziri, while touring New Zealand. While he didn't use the Iron Sheik name that he had started using the prior year, he had the same look and outfit that he would use for the rest of his career. He captured their British Commonwealth title, the major belt in the country where wrestling at the time was very big on television, from Rick Martel. His first role as a headliner in the US was in 1978, working for Don Owen in the Pacific Northwest as the Iron Sheik, the heel tag team partner of Apache Bull Ramos, the territory's top villain for a number of years. They worked regularly in a feud with top babyfaces Dutch Savage and Jimmy Snuka. The athleticism displayed by a lighter Sheik and Snuka, perhaps the best American flying wrestler of the time, was well ahead of its time, and he got the reputation as a heel who could get heat and really work. Ramos and Sheik beat Jerry Oates and Jesse Ventura to win the Pacific Northwest Tag Team titles on August 18, 1978. They lost them to Savage and Snuka on June 10 in Portland. This came during the filming of the PBS documentary, Savage, based around the Oregon wrestling circuit and its top star, Dutch Savage. This aired all over the country and was a rare mainstream look at the business, which included impressive clips of a prime working Iron Sheik in the ring. Another famous story from that period involved Ricky Hunter, a very tough veteran wrestler who had strong legit training. In those days, Elton Owen, the promoter in Eugene and Salem, would pay wrestlers $25 or $50 extra if they do a few minutes of shooting within their work matches. Often the wrestlers worked together to pretend to shoot and get their bonus. It's a 45-year-old story, but all the wrestlers who saw it said it was legit, that Hunter stuffed every Sheik takedown and even ended up turning Sheik's shoulders. The Sheik name, of course, came from the success of the other Sheik, Ed Farhat, the top heel in the business a few years earlier and who was still a major star. The Sheik was billed from Syria, but the Middle East to Americans was well-heel Arabs in those days. Snuka came up with the idea of the curly-toed boot that was his trademark. He was also known for twirling Persian clubs, a unique training exercise used by amateur wrestlers in that era. Carl got used to use it as well, as in those days the idea was that weightlifting made you stiff and hurt your athleticism. So those who didn't believe in heavy free weight training would use those types of exercises and body weight exercises. That's what amateur wrestlers in different parts of the world were using at the time. Because it was all about technique and getting used to it, Sheik would challenge fans in the stands to twirl the clubs, and without the technique could never do it, while Sheik did it with ease. With the idea in these smaller grassroots promotions to show he was a superior strength athlete. He would also challenge the babyfaces wrestlers to do it, and at times would gimmick the clubs and make them lighter so the top babyface, like say Dick Murdoch when he was doing his Patriot gimmick as Captain Redneck, would be able to upstage Sheik when fans and other wrestlers couldn't. He was working in the AWA after Oregon in 1978, mostly in prelims, often against powerlifting champion turned wrestler Paul Ellering. He was brought to the WWF after that run, in 1979, as the Great Hossein Arab, managed by Fred Blassie, likely in deference to the Sheik, whose name was still big. At the time he was considered too small to be a headliner, but as a worker and heel, he was better in the ring than most in the territory. Unlike most heels who would be built up on television with squash wins and then work the major arenas against Backlund and move down the card, Sheik was booked mostly in lower card matches in the major cities. He did get title shots at Backlund in places like Glens Falls, New York, Albany, New York, and Waterville, Maine. His debut in Madison Square Garden was on June 4, 1979, as part of the first Battle Royal in the history of the building, where the winner would face Backlund for the title in the main event, which drew 17,000 fans. He won the Battle Royal, and the Backlund match went about 30 minutes and was a higher quality than most of the Backlund title matches at the time, since both men had high respect for the other's athletic ability. But it was a one and done. He wrestled Backlund for the title on October 6 at the Capitol Center in Landover, Maryland, before 10,393. He remained as a secondary heel in the promotion when things changed. On November 4, 1979, 52 Americans were taken hostage in the Iranian hostage crisis. Iran suddenly became the leading enemy of the U.S. Hossein had been billed from the start from Tehran, Iran, but he was just the Arabian heel who could wrestle and twirl the clubs and would have blasted to his promos for the most part. Literally, he became the most hated wrestler in the promotion. Because of the tenseness of the situation, they never played up the hostage crisis when it was going on, and his spot in the promotion didn't change much even with the heat he was getting. He got a few notable Madison Square Garden wins over Ted DiBiase, who was leaving, and Chief Jay Strongbow, who was no longer being protected as he had been most of the prior decade, to build for a December 17, 1979, match with Antonio Inoki over the NWF title on a Garden show being televised on TV Asahi in Japan. It was by no means a major match on that show, but more a favor for the Japanese partners where they put in a heel who was a good wrestler in with Inoki and they had a good match. Inoki was not really all that popular in the US during his occasional MSG matches, but with Hossein as his opponent, the crowd got behind Inoki more than usual. He was the right guy for the spot. The match went so well from Inoki's side that he booked him, as the Iron Sheik, to a spring 1980 New Japan tour. With his amateur background along with working ability, he was protected most of the tour, doing DQ losses to the top stars Inoki, Seiji Sakaguchi and Tatsumi Fujinami until the final days. The big show on the tour was April 3rd at the Old Sumo Hall, where North American Tag Champions Sakaguchi and Riki Choshu retained over Sheik and Super Destroyer, Don Jardine, underneath Inoki's NWF title win over Stan Hansen. On the way out, he did lose singles bouts to both Sakaguchi and Choshu. He went back for the 1982 Madison Square Garden Series, which was essentially what is now the G1 Climax tournament in the spring. He wasn't protected at all there, finishing 1-12, with one win over Choshu but losses to Fujinami, Rusher Kimura, Murdoch Killer Khan, Tony Atlas, Masked Superstar, Don Muraco, Yoshiaki Yatsu, Sakaguchi, Tiger Taguchi, Kim Duke, Andre the Giant and Inoki. In 1992 he went back to Japan for Uefi, in his last match ever under his real name Khosrau Vaziri. Since they purported themselves to be real, they didn't want an Iron Sheik. Vaziri was 50 at this point, long past his prime, and while he had a shooter rep in the US, he was no longer that person and not in shape. He made a poor showing against Yoji Angio and was never brought back again. In April 1980 he went to the Carolinas, first as Hussein Arab, but then became the Iron Sheik. In the Carolinas, they did play into the ongoing hostage crisis and gave him a more sustained heel push, and given the time frame, he got tremendous heat. He won the Mid-Atlantic title from Jim Brunzell on May 11, 1980, in Charlotte, North Carolina, and held it through November 1, 1980, losing to Ricky Steamboat in Richmond, Virginia in a Falls Count Anywhere match. He often teamed with Snuka, was the heel in a feud with Ivan Koloff, and frequently wrestled a babyface Ric Flair. His big feud was with Blackjack Mulligan in all kinds of gimmick matches like street fights, cage matches, and other gimmick matches. In Toronto, which focused on the Carolinas wrestlers at the time, he had a major feud with Angela Mosca, the top local babyface, over the Canadian heavyweight title, which Sheik won twice. Sheik won the title from Dewey Robertson on May 25 in Maple Leaf Gardens before 14,834 fans. On June 29, 1980, he lost it to Mosca on July 30 in a no-DQ match after a DQ finish in a previous match, and won it back on August 10. On November 2, he retained over Flair in a main event that drew 12,000 fans. He then lost it in a cage match on December 28, Mosca before 14,007 fans. As champion he also faced Tiger Jeet Singh, but in all that year was remembered by Toronto fans for the 6 Hossein vs. Mosca brawls in Maple Leaf Gardens. Even with those titles and feuding with top guys, he was voted most underrated in the 1980 Observer poll, which tells you how respected of a worker he was at the time. He went from territory to territory as a star heel after leaving Crockett in the summer of 1981, working Southwest, Mid-South Florida, Georgia, World Class, Southern California, New Japan, Tennessee, and Puerto Rico. The hostage crisis was over, but the hatred for Iranians in the US remained, so he was a very effective heel and pushed everywhere. His background, as the former bodyguard for the Shah of Iran, likely the most hated political figure in the US at the time, was played up in some places and not so much in others. In Florida, the Iron Sheik arrived with J.J. Dillon as his manager, claiming to have been from Saudi Arabia, which in those days wasn't a bad thing as compared to Iran in the xenophobic wrestling angle department. Then Eric Embry claimed he was from Iran and that Dylan and Sheik were lying. Killer Carl Cox, whose gimmick was that he was a former U.S. Marine, in his last angle in the territory in early 1982, claimed through the Freedom of Information Act, he had photographic proof that the Iron Sheik was from Iran, showing photos of him in warm-up sweatsuits that said Iran on them and photos of him with the wife of the Shah, noting evidence that he was her bodyguard for 3 years and had photos of him in the Iranian military. He claimed, although photos were never shown, that when both President John F. Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson visited the Shah in diplomatic missions, that the Sheik was present as his bodyguard. There was also a photo of him with famous Russian weightlifter Vasily Alexeyev while wearing his Iran warm-ups, claimed to be from the 1968 Olympics that he was always reputed to have won a medal in. While he looked completely different, younger, full head of hair, and much lighter, Gordon Soley would vouch for the photos to fans, saying that you put on hair and a mustache and add some weight and it's the Iron Sheik, which proved he was from Iran. The gimmick was Sheik was at the time denying being Iranian. Solely played up the idea of an actual real Iranian in the promotion was unspeakable at the time, as the hostage crisis was a major memory and wrestling in those days in Southern territories played hard on patriotism and right-wing value structures. Dylan came out and called Cox a liar, and then jumped on Cox, who got the better of it. Sheik jumped on it, and behind the desk, where you couldn't see anything, you just saw Sheik and Dylan pounding apparently on Cox, as well as Sheik taking a stool in Soley's chair and swinging it up and down, theoretically on Cox. Later in the show, Mr. Wrestling 2 came out with the shirt Cox was wearing, and the shirt was covered in blood, while Wrestling 2 said that he had never seen a man do so much damage to another man with his bare hands. This was to write Cox out of the promotion and lead to people like Wrestling 2 and Dick Murdoch, the protege of Cox, going for revenge. Dylan later admitted that Sheik was from Iran, but they lied because he wouldn't be able to get him into the country if he was Iranian due to the hostage crisis. Dylan then said the Heat line, telling Soley that all the hostages had been released, so why is everyone still so upset? The funny part of all that is Vaziri had worked in Florida in 1973 and 1974, billed as a former Iranian Olympic medalist, used in technical prelim matches, but they counted on the idea that fans in 1982 would not remember any of that. In 1983, working in Georgia, he won a tournament for the national television title, beating Ronnie Garvin via DQ in the finals on May 28 in Atlanta, before losing it to Garvin on July 27 in Atlanta. In pro wrestling, Khosrow Vaziri and Ali Vaziri, the names he used before the Iron Sheik, was played up as an amateur great. Nobody expected wrestling fans to know anything, so he was often billed as a gold medalist in Greco-Roman wrestling in the 1968 Olympics, and other times as a silver medalist. Masa Saito, who placed 6th in the 1964 Olympics in freestyle, made a career in the U.S. billed as a gold or silver medalist as well. Vaziri was a great amateur wrestler, good enough to tour with the Iranian national team, but placed second in the 1968 Olympic trials for Iran and never actually competed in the Olympics. Vaziri grew up in Iran, idolizing Gholam Reza Tikti, the country's national sports hero who won an Olympic silver medal in 1952, a gold in 1956 and another silver in 1964 in wrestling. Wrestling and soccer were the two biggest sports in the country, so an Iranian, who competed in 4 Olympics, he placed 4th in 1964, and won 2 additional world championships, was a household name and national idol. When Tikti died in 1968, it was officially called a suicide, but many believed he was murdered by the government because he was an outspoken critic of the Shah and because wrestlers in the country were so revered. The belief was they had to get rid of him because his anti-administration voice was so powerful. Vaziri was already one of Iran's top wrestlers at this point and also the bodyguard for Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. Vaziri was among those who believed the government, in particular the Shah's secret police, had killed Tikti, and believed, because they had become close, that he was in danger, and defected the country and wound up in Minnesota. Tikti, was so popular in Iran. Vaziri noted about that period. He was like the Michael Jordan. Everyone loved him. And I was number 2, his protege. I thought, if they got him, they're probably going to get me, too. I knew I had to leave. He fled the country, ironically similar to his most famous tag team partner, Nikolai Volkov, Josip Peruzovic, who had defected from Croatia as a super heavyweight on their national weightlifting team while in Canada and somehow met up with Stu Hart and became a pro wrestler. Vaziri defected to the U.S. and was constantly afraid of going back to Iran after he became famous, to see his family in that country, believing he would be killed. Music executive Mike Omansky became friends with him and told him he never saw his family in Iran again, and they never met his family in the U.S. Sheik did 2 fundraising shows for Omansky's cousin, Jeff Bookantz, to raise money for the U.S. fencing team, doing a single and tag match against Bookantz, who worked as the Mighty McCabe in the 80s, and Omansky produced DVDs for the events to sell in the $1 bins at Walmart and other dollar stores, with the first volume selling an unheard of 600,000 copies. Vaziri ended up in Minneapolis. He trained for the 1972 Olympic team. He placed second at 180.5 pounds in the AAU National Greco-Roman Championships in both 1969, the same year Bob Roop won the national championship at 220 pounds, and 1970, losing to Wayne Bowman and Rudy Williams, respectively. Before winning the championship in 1971, he was hopeful of being on the 1972 Olympic team, but had not become a naturalized citizen in time. As a pro wrestler, it was those 2 silver medals and a gold medal that were billed as Olympic medals that Sheik wore around his neck, until they were stolen from a hotel room he and Volkov were staying in together in Newark, New Jersey. Vern Gagne, who supported amateur wrestling in the area, invited Vaziri along with others to a pro wrestling camp. Vaziri was in camp with former college football players Brunzel and his son Greg Gagne, as well as Richard Fleer, Ric Flair, Olympic weightlifter Ken Patera and Bob Bruggers, a college football and basketball player who was a third-round draft choice of the Miami Dolphins and played 5 years in the NFL. All become top pro stars except for Bruggers, whose career ended in the famous 1975 plane crash that involved Flair, Johnny Valentine, Tim Woods, and David Crockett. Because he couldn't compete in the Olympics, Vaziri became an assistant coach for the U.S. Greco-Roman national team at the 1972 Olympics. The Gagne camps were known for being insane torture, with most quitting in the first few days. Fleer even quit, although Gagne felt he had so much potential for pro wrestling, then he basically went to his house, pulled him out of his house, and slapped him around until Fleer agreed to come back. Vaziri, who was in stellar condition from wrestling, was able to survive. The people in camp were never told wrestling was fake while they were tortured. They likely all knew it, but it was never said to them until camp was over and they were ready to start their careers. While in camp, Vaziri was not quiet about everyone being bullied by Robinson, who was just brutal to everyone in teaching them the ropes. Vaziri would say to everyone that he could beat Gagne and Robinson in a wrestling match. Robinson heard about it, and was furious and basically said Vaziri could have a go with him. Robinson had trouble turning Vaziri using amateur moves, so he used a move illegal in wrestling and used his knee to dislocate Vaziri's hip. Still, Vaziri came back for more after healing up. Gagne got tremendous heat from the Minnesota amateur wrestling community about one of his wrestlers deliberately hurting the national team coach. Vaziri, with his own coaching experience, never forgot it and always said that a teacher should never, ever, do something like that to his student. At another point in camp, Vaziri was talking about how phony some of the pro wrestling moves were, and in particular the flying dropkick. The word got back to Gagne about the dropkick, one of his signature moves, and that Vaziri said he could beat Gagne, who was the AWA World Heavyweight Champion at the time, although he was 46 at this time. At one point when they were doing some scrimmaging, out of nowhere, when Vaziri, who went low for a takedown and had no idea it was coming, Gagne threw a shoot dropkick right to Vaziri's face, bloodying up his nose and giving him a fat lip. Flair, who wrote about the Robinson incident in his first autobiography and talked about it many times, wrote, "My dear friend Khosrow Vaziri. We started wrestling together in 1972. Seems like so long ago. We crossed paths so many times over the year and you were always so entertaining. The greatest line you ever said to me in 1972, if I had your hair, I would be with Elizabeth Taylor. Rest in peace, my friend. Be as entertaining to God as you were to all of us." After going through the camp, he had real issues with pro wrestling at first because he was asked to lose matches. He was at times in tears in the dressing room, saying that maybe 6 guys in the world could beat him and he couldn't understand why he was always told to lose. Vaziri was later used as a coach at Gagne's camps, and continued to coach the U.S. Greco-Roman national team while still working as a pro wrestler. He later coached the 1976 Olympic team, which included future pro Brad Rheingans, who placed 4th at 220 pounds. Vaziri was a regular pro wrestler at the time, although not any kind of a star, but there were wrestling fans who saw the Greco-Roman matches and noticed him in Rheingans' corner. Gagne used Vaziri and Robinson as his shooters at his 1973 camp, which included Bob Remus, the future Sergeant Slaughter, Paul Pershman, the future Playboy Buddy Rose, and one of the most dominant collegiate heavyweight wrestlers of all time, 420-pound Chris Taylor. Taylor won 87-01 in college, winning NCAA titles in 1972 and 1973, as well as a bronze medal in freestyle in the 1972 Olympics, losing a very controversial match to Russian gold medalist Alexander Medved. Taylor, at the time, was the heaviest athlete in the history of Olympic competition. It was said that Vaziri tried out Taylor, but the size difference was too much and he couldn't do a thing with him. His first pro match was believed to have been January 28, 1973, facing Johnny Heidman in Duluth, Minnesota, and going to a draw. He worked prelims in the area, often against fellow training partners also starting out like Flair and Brunzell before going to work for Leroy McGuirk's promotion in Louisiana, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Mississippi and parts of northern Texas and southern Missouri. He went from place to place, not making any money, but gaining experience and a reputation, for the next 3 years before the name change. It was August 23, 1983, when Vaziri wrestled his first television match for the WWF under the Iron Sheik name. Once again he wasn't pushed to the top, although did get a title shot at Backlund in Philadelphia on Thanksgiving Day that drew 10,000 fans. The top heel was masked superstar, Bill Eadie. But when the WWF was planning on going national behind Hogan, the decision was made for Sheik to be the interim champion and beat Backlund. The idea was that Backlund respected Sheik because Sheik was a legitimate wrestler and wrestling coach, so he wouldn't have an issue putting him over. Even more, Hogan was doing a U.S. patriotic hero gimmick, and it made more sense to kick off Hulkamania in the WWF with a win over Sheik than it would have with a win over Superstar, even though at the time Superstar was considered a bigger international star. The Backlund losing the title angle was basically a knockoff of the 1971 angle when Bruno Sammartino lost it for the first time. In 1971, the story was that in a match in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, on January 15 with Sammartino and Dominic DeNucci beating George Steele and Baron Michael Shikluna via DQ, that Steele had injured Sammartino and separated his shoulder. So Sammartino was going into the Ivan Koloff match 3 days later with the injury. This enabled not just Koloff, but also Steele, to be key Sammartino opponents going forward as Steele was partially responsible and Sammartino went in hurt. In this case, on the television the weekend before the December 26, 1983, Backlund vs. Sheik title match, Backlund came out to answer Sheik's challenge of twirling the Persian clubs. He tried twice, but couldn't do it. But Backlund wouldn't give up, and on the third try, was twirling the clubs. Sheik attacked him. The idea was that the club was supposed to land on his shoulder and neck. But that didn't happen. So Backlund went down, had to grab one of the clubs, and clumsily rolled it on top of his neck and shoulder. Even at the time it was corny, because Backlund had to grab the club and roll it onto his neck while down on the ground, and worse, it exposed how light the different gimmick club that was used for the angle as compared to the one Sheik had been using was. Still, it was the Christmas show and the big draw was Jimmy Snuka teaming with Buddy Rogers, who ended up injured in the dressing room they said prior to the match and replaced by Arnold Skolland, in what was to be Rogers' first MSG match since 1963, against Don Morocco and Lou Albano. They sold out Madison Square Garden and did about 2,500 more at the Felt Forum. Backlund's neck went out during the match and Sheik put him in the camel clutch. Backlund refused to submit, and Skolland threw in the towel at the 11:50 mark, shocking the crowd in MSG who had never once seen Backlund lose cleanly. The entire wrestling world was in disarray. The day before, Hogan had no-showed a sold-out St. Paul Civic Center for the annual Christmas show. Hogan, who had been in Japan for the New Japan Tag Team Tournament where Hogan and Inoki beat Murdoch and Adrian Adonis in the finals, had sent a telegram to Verne Gagne saying he wasn't coming back. Gagne continued to advertise Hogan for the next month of shows anyway. Vince McMahon then did a television taping from St. Louis, with Hogan, Gene Okerlund and David Schultz from the AWA appearing as well as Roddy Piper from the Carolinas. The world had changed. After Backlund had lost, in the building they announced the January 23, 1984 show, with Sheik vs. Backlund in a rematch for the title. But later on television, they brought Backlund out to say he was injured, and then brought in Hogan to be his replacement. The new era was about to start. Of course, the Backlund injury was only for New York. Backlund beat Superstar in a lumberjack match in Landover, Maryland, in what was advertised as a title match, in the main event. But at the show, they announced Sheik's win and he retained in the semi against prelim wrestler Salvatore Bellomo. Sheik as champion defended over the next several weeks against prelim wrestlers Bob Bradley in an underneath match one night, beat Strongbow in the main event another night, beat Pat Patterson via DQ underneath the IC title match with Morocco vs. Atlas another. He'd worked twice with DQ finishes against Backlund in Boston, which nearly sold out with 14,800, and Monongahela, Pennsylvania, a few more times with Patterson and Strongbow, as well was in Philadelphia against Tito Santana, which drew 15,631, and in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, against Ivan Putski. In Pittsburgh, against Strongbow in Philadelphia, it was Backlund vs. Superstar that was billed as the main event in both cities. Legend has it that Verne Gagne called Sheik and offered him $75,000, which was a ton of money at the time, to break Hogan's leg in the match. Greg Gagne has denied the story. Given that Hogan had just walked out on Gagne with no notice and doing no jobs on the way out, with nothing but a telegram, the story is very believable. Everyone at the time believed it, and Hogan was always deferential to Sheik for not taking Gagne up on the offer, which would have changed wrestling history. Everyone pretty much could see Hogan was winning the title on January 23, 1984, in Madison Square Garden, even if they couldn't see the worldwide ramifications this match would end up having. The show drew a double sellout of 25,000 with MSG and the Felt Forum both sold out, even though the show also aired live on local cable television. It was meant to be quick and explosive. Sheik got Hogan in the camel clutch, the move that had beaten Backlund. Hogan simply powered up, backed Sheik into the turnbuckles, and then hulked up, unhurt, not selling, and did his comeback and pinned Sheik in just 5:30 to win the title. "The Iron Sheik graciously passed the torch to me," Hogan said in a documentary on Viziri. "Because once the Iron Sheik put me over, the Hulkamania thing was unstoppable." Among the Hogan-Sheik rematches were February 11th in Boston, where Hogan won a Texas death match before a near sellout of 14,500, February 24th with a complete sellout of 18,500 in Pittsburgh, and Mach 4 with a complete sellout of 19,000 in Landover, Maryland. Sheik was next used for the turn of Slaughter. It started when it was noted that Slaughter was sad about the death of his manager, the Grand Wizard, Ernie Roth, who had been a fixture in the WWF since 1971. Slaughter became a patriotic ex-Marine, and Sheik was the perfect opponent. With the exception of Bruno Sammartino versus Larry Zbyszko, it was the best-drawing non-championship WWF feud of the era. The two sold out the Capitol Center on April 8th with 19,000, nearly sold out Boston on April 14th with 14,500, sold out Madison Square Garden on April 23rd with 20,000, drew 13,000 on April 27th in Pittsburgh, and drew 10,500 on May 12th in Boston. Slaughter vs. Sheik was so hot that it was significantly outdrawing Sheik's title matches at the same time with Hogan. The most famous of their matches was the Boot Camp match on June 16, 1984, in Madison Square Garden, which was one of the best WWF matches of that period. It was often compared with the 1981 Slaughter vs. Pat Patterson alley fight as the best MSG bouts of the era, and with no world title match, did a double sellout of 25,000 in Madison Square Garden and the Felt Forum. Sheik was Slaughter's most famous opponent during his babyface tenure, and Sheik's most famous career feud. The two at different periods wrestled each other at least 150 times. Hogan-Sheik rematch on the December 28th show in Madison Square Garden, which Hogan won in just 4:34, basically a copy of the title change match, drew another double sellout of 25,000. By the irony of all ironies, when Viziri was first in Minnesota to earn money to support him while he trained in Greco-Roman wrestling, he worked as a roofer for Remus Roofing out of Eden Prairie, Minnesota. If Remus sounds familiar, it's because the owner's son Robert, a high school wrestler and football player at the time, would grow up to become Sergeant Slaughter. Very saddened to hear that my favorite in-ring opponent, Khosrow Viziri, passed away this morning, Slaughter wrote after hearing of his rival's death. In 1984, we helped build sports entertainment into what it is today and paved the yellow brick road for those who have followed. Sheik and Volkoff were then put together as a team. They beat Barry Windham and Mike Rotundo for the WWF Tag Team titles at the first WrestleMania when Sheik hit Windham with Blassie's cane. This is the most remembered period of Sheik's active career, particularly when Volkoff would sing the Russian national anthem, called Gene Okerlund, who was the best man at his 1976 wedding when he was still a prelim wrestler in the AWA. Gene, mean in interviews, was a character in the CBS Saturday morning cartoon Hulk Hogan's Rock and Wrestling and appeared in a Cyndi Lauper Goonies video. The iconic vision was Volkoff singing to a chorus of loud boos, while Sheik stood there and saluted. And then after the fans were unruly to Volkoff singing, Sheik would then wave an Iranian flag with an airbrushed image of the Ayatollah flag that was made for him when he worked in Tennessee, and Jerry Lawler did the artwork, and then he'd grab the mic and say, "Iran number 1. Russia number 1. USA Act 2E," and spit on the ground. Sheik and Volkoff remained champions as Blassie was taken off the road and replaced as their manager by Ken Johnson, better known as Slick, the Doctor of Style. Windham and Rotundo won the titles back on June 17, 1985, at the TV tapings in Poughkeepsie. They remained as a regular tag team until Sheik's first in a series of firings. Business was big at the time, particularly shows with either Hogan or matches like Snuka vs. Roddy Piper on top, where Sheik and Volkoff would be second from the top against Windham and Rotundo. Sheik and Volkoff's strongest headline matches were May 4, 1986 in Montreal against Jacques Jr. and Raymond Rojo, and a June 15 rematch that drew 13,500 and 13,000 respectively. A November 10, 1986 match against tag champions Dynamite Kid and Davey Boy Smith in Calgary drew 11,000. In late 1986, when the tag team titles were held by the British Bulldogs, Kid Smith, Dynamite was seriously injured when his back went out coming off the ropes, likely from the accumulation of damage from the style he worked. There was fear at the time he would never wrestle again. Even though he was bedridden, McMahon ordered him to come to Tampa, where he'd be injured prior to a match with Sheik and Volkov, never get in the ring, and Smith would lose the titles. Kid was bitter for the rest of his life about flying from Calgary while unable to walk, because they insisted on his dropping the titles, and then getting the standard $50 television taping payoff. But he agreed to do it, but said only if the loss was to the Hart Foundation of Bret Hart and Jim Neidhart, which is the actual reason they first became tag team champions and were the area's top team for a time. The company then reprised the 1984 Slaughter feud with Jim Duggan in 1987. Slaughter had left the company, and Duggan, who had come in from being the top star in Bill Watts' UWF promotion, was the new Patriot, walking to the ring holding a 2x4 board, which was a Watts idea as a takeoff of the Buford Pusser character in the original Walking Tall movie. Once when Vince McMahon and I were discussing Sheik, he made a mention that Sheik or Marty Jannetty held the record for most times being fired. Sheik's first actual firing was in 1987. At the time, babyfaces and heels were not supposed to travel together, let alone people feuding with each other. Sheik and Duggan weren't regular traveling partners, but something happened and they ended up driving to a show together on May 28. Duggan was driving and they were pulled over. After searching the car and finding a small amount of marijuana on Duggan and an 8-ball of cocaine on Sheik, both were arrested. McMahon was furious immediately, but when it got out in the media and became a laughingstock of two wrestlers in such a heated feud driving together to the show doing drugs, both were fired a few days later. McMahon gave a speech to talent warning them about giving the company this kind of bad publicity, and emphasized that Duggan nor Sheik would never be brought back. A lot of wrestlers were very upset, given most of the locker room used marijuana to ease the pain of the brutal travel schedule, and Duggan was very well liked. The story was covered everywhere, including making the front page of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. It was so embarrassing to his family that his wife kept her 3 daughters home from school the next 3 days. Duggan was brought back a few months later. At the end of August, Paul Boesch and WWF promoted Bosch's retirement show, and Boesch was given full control of the booking and guest list. Duggan was a big favorite from Mid-South Wrestling, and Boesch booked a match with Duggan against Ted DiBiase, which was a major Mid-South feud years earlier. DiBiase liked Duggan, and was one of the best workers in the business. Boesch's hope was that DiBiase would carry Duggan to a great match, and McMahon, who was there for the show, would see it and hire Duggan back. Instead, since Duggan hadn't wrestled in months, he suffered a torn hamstring and limped his way through the match. Still, the talent that saw him in the dressing room gutting his way through the injury, and McMahon, were sympathetic to him, and he got his job back. When WWE did a European tour in October, they brought Sheik back for a few dates to work with Duggan based on their feud from earlier in the year. Sheik was brought back the next February. He had gained a lot of weight and wasn't pushed, and by July he was gone again. He wrestled in Texas, AWA, where he feuded with Slaughter again, though few remember it, and Puerto Rico, where he feuded with Atlas and Carlos Colon. Colon beat Sheik via DQ to retain the Universal title on January 6, 1988, at the Roberto Clemente Coliseum in San Juan before 12,000 fans. The rematch, on January 30th, in the same stadium, with Chicky Star in a cage above the ring, drew 13,000. Sheik came into WCW in 1989 and feuded with Steamboat and Sting. At one point he was to be the trainer for Ron Simmons, to give Simmons a big heel push, but that was dropped. Sheik wasn't used at all, but in one of those famous WCW blunders, they forgot to give him notice, so his one-year contract at $156,000 rolled over for a second year, and he ended up being used on our shows through early 1991. At this point, Slaughter had turned heel and sided with Iraq and Saddam Hussein, who were the latest Middle Eastern enemies of the U.S., for a feud with Hogan over the WWF title. Sheik, now Colonel Mustafa, and now from Iraq instead of Iran, and General Adnan al-Qaisi, who was legitimately from Iraq and, like Sheik, was a top amateur wrestler in his youth, formed the Top Heel group with Slaughter. They main evented the 1991 SummerSlam in a handicap match against Hogan and Ultimate Warrior, which was the night Warrior was fired over his own contract issue with McMahon. Slaughter turned after the match as well, reprising his feud with Sheik, now Mustafa. Mustafa was at this point no longer the performer he was in the 80s, between gaining weight and drug issues, and was fired again in May 1992, when drug testing was getting going. Once, Vince McMahon called him into his office and told him that he had tested positive. Sheik started celebrating, thinking the test showed him being clean, which he clearly was not. Then McMahon explained testing positive wasn't a good thing and had to let him go. At another point, when at customs waiting to go into Canada, he unzipped his bag, took out the cocaine, and put it in the sweatshirt hood of John Noor, the berserker. This led to another firing. He was completely nuts, a precursor to his social media character that kept him as a public figure until his death. Sometimes he would be in the local supermarket and start yelling at shoppers for carts filled with junk food, even taking the food out of the carts. Sheik worked indies all over the world for the next few years. He was back in WWF in 1996 as the Iron Sheik, the manager of the Sultan Solofafatu, who later became Rikishi. The Sultan was a masked wrestler playing the role of a Middle Eastern heel. He also at one point managed Tiger Ali Singh, the son of Tiger Jeet Singh. He was fired in late 1997 after failing another drug test. He made various appearances on WWE television through 2010. His last match in WWF was the Legends Battle Royal at the 2001 WrestleMania. By this time, he was heavily cheered and won the Battle Royal largely because he was so crippled up by ring injuries that he couldn't possibly take the bump over the top rope. His drug issues got worse and worse over the years. After his days making money in wrestling were over, he would sometimes go into the lobby of the Ramada Inn near Hartsfield Airport in Atlanta, carry a replica WWF Championship belt, and bring 8x10 photos that he'd sell and write autographs for travelers for $10 a pop. After a day of work, he and his closest friend would drive to the bad part of Atlanta and trade the cash for crack cocaine. Sometimes he'd also just bring signed photos for the dealers themselves to sell in exchange for crack. Besides never seeing his original family after defecting, he had other tragedies besides his constant battle with drug issues. He was married for 47 years to Carol Peterson, who he met while living in Minnesota. He had 3 daughters and 5 grandchildren. His oldest daughter, Marissa Vaziri, was 27 when she was murdered by her 38-year-old boyfriend, Charles Reynolds, in 2003. Because of the celebrity status of the Iron Sheik, the story that got national attention, Reynolds was convicted of the murder and sentenced to life in prison. He later died in prison in 2016. Vaziri had trained his 3 daughters to be tough, as after his days on the road were over, he would train them and other neighborhood kids in calisthenics and amateur wrestling. The belief is that the two were popping pills and drinking and something went wrong. There had been a party at their apartment that night, and everyone had left. Vaziri, who, like her sisters, looked like a model, was ruled to have died via strangulation. Reynolds later told police she wouldn't calm down. Was I thinking? I was wrong. Now I must die. I want to die, I want to trade. She's such a good girl. But she wouldn't calm down. I didn't know what else to do. It wasn't me. This must be a dream. The police reports indicated Reynolds slept in the same bed with Vaziri in their apartment after he had killed her. The next morning he called his pastor, the Reverend Mark Medlin, and told him to come to the apartment. Medlin and 2 other church members prayed with Reynolds. After praying, Reynolds showed Medlin and the others into the bedroom, where Vaziri's body was on a bed. After police arrived, Reynolds told them, "I'm sure I'm the reason she's not breathing. She was on pills, I was on pills, and we were drinking. It's my fault. It's my fault. Take me, I've done wrong. You hear me?" Reynolds had previously been in prison prior for 9 years for almost killing a man during a fight. But Vaziri and none of her friends were aware of that until afterwards, but they knew of problems and Reynolds was more and more possessive and once in an argument punched out a window of her car. A few days before her death, Vaziri emailed a friend and told her she wanted Reynolds to leave the apartment he had helped her get, but she felt pity for him because he had nowhere else to live. Greenberg told the story from Sheik's side, saying that he had brought a razor blade and hit it in his cheek when he came into the courtroom in Jonesboro, Georgia. At the time of his daughter's death, Sheik was recovering from knee replacement surgery. He was going to cut a man's throat and had good reason to do so. From the gallery, he narrowed his eyes and contemplated 38-year-old Charles Warren Reynolds, who rose nervously from the defendant's table. When the judge asked him to address the court, Reynolds broke into tears and apologized for the murder of the Iron Sheik's 27-year-old daughter, Marissa. In court, the Sheik's Minnesota-born wife, Carol, warned the rest of the family about her husband's homicidal intentions. The family knew the story and would not allow him to do it. "You can't kill him because they'll put you in prison." His daughter Tanya whispered, "I lost my sister and don't want to lose my father." Those words stopped Sheik from his planned attempt to slice the throat of Reynolds, and he made a pledge to his daughter that he was going to quit drugs, particularly crack cocaine, that he had been addicted to. His daughter Tanya told Greenberg about this time frame, saying, "He stopped drugs cold turkey. Unfortunately, we were all in a very weak place, and he went back." His family forced him into rehab in 2005, and stated in papers that Sheik's drug habit made him a danger to himself and others, but an employee at the rehab facility snuck him in an 8-ball. "That's the way it always was," Tanya said. "People were taken by his celebrity, and they wanted him to like them. When the cops would arrest him, they'd drive him home instead of bringing him to jail. Every time we'd try to help him, he'd charm these fans and they'd push back against us." Sheik suffered a heart attack in 2005 while in Toronto doing a public appearance while messed up on drugs. In 2007, his wife moved out, saying to Greenberg, "I could no longer beg him to quit. We had lost our daughter. We were all sad and depressed. But enough was enough." In 2009, after Sheik agreed to fully cut ties with his best friend and drug buddy, they reconciled. He claimed to have given up cocaine at that point, but still drank. But he claimed to have turned around his life at that point. Reader Alexander Kushan noted that for Iranians living in the US, even though Sheik was always a heel, he was a hero to them. I'm a first-generation Iranian American. I don't know if you or your listeners are aware of how important the Sheik was to Iranian American kids growing up in the 80s. It felt like the Ayatollah and the Sheik were the only Iranians we ever saw on TV. Kids like me could never support the Ayatollah. Our families fled Iran because of his regime. The Sheik, though, he was our guy. We rooted and cheered for the Sheik regardless of him being the evil foreign menace. He looked and sounded like our fathers, grandfathers and uncles. He spoke Farsi in interviews. He was a hero to us and for me and my brother. He helped create a bond with our father that continues to this day. My dad would tape Saturday night's main event for us to watch in the morning, and he still claims that the Sheik had the best suplexes. It's strange how I am so saddened by the death of a man I never met, yet somehow it's like I lost a family member. Sheik was inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame in 2005, the NWA Hall of Fame in 2008 and Trago/Thez Hall of Fame in 2016.